Number 1.
In August of 1934, 21-year-old Olga Mauger seemed to have things going pretty well for her. She had just married wealthy Wyoming oil magnate Carl Mauger after a 2-week whirlwind romance, and the two were madly in love. They also had an upcoming elk hunting trip in the scenic wilderness near Dubois, Wyoming, that they saw as a romantic honeymoon. It seemed as if she had her whole future ahead of her, but she was about to become the center of one of Wyoming's oldest and strangest unsolved mysteries. The couple made their way to a place called Floyd Stelmacher Camp at Togwitee Pass up in the remote mountains just 6 days after their wedding, and at first the trip was everything they had hoped it would be. On September 17, 1934, the 6th day of their trip, the couple headed out into the wilderness on a scout expedition for elk. At some point during their hike, Carl told his wife he wanted to go up a small ridge not too far away, but Olga said that she was tired and wanted to take a rest. It was a bit strange because Olga was an avid hunter, athletic and in incredible shape, to the point that it was usually Carl trying to keep up with her, but at the time he didn't think much of it, and continued up the ridge as she sat down on a rock to rest. Little did he know that this would be the last time he would ever see her again. When Carl returned to the same spot 20 minutes later, his wife was nowhere to be seen. A quick search around the area turned up nothing else, and his calls out to her remained unanswered. Not long after this, authorities were summoned and they would launch a massive search involving an aircraft and over 300 people, bloodhounds, and even 20 Native American trackers, but they could find no trace of her. The dogs brought in could not find a scent trail. There was nothing. The only thing they managed to turn up was an empty paper sack in which there had been 3 sandwiches, but no sign of the food. How is it that she could so completely vanish within 20 minutes to the point that not even dogs and expert native trackers could pick up her trail? No one had a clue, but as night approached and the weather got very cold, it was feared that wherever she had gone, Olga, who had been lightly dressed, might not survive. Nevertheless, the search continued on into the coming weeks, and there were some clues that would show up during this time. One was that some local campers would claim to have heard a woman screaming out in the woods of a nearby canyon 3 days after she had gone missing, but this could not be confirmed to have been her. There was also much excitement when a set of footprints were found at a wooded area known as Turpin Meadows, about 8 miles from where Olga had gone missing. The tracks were first thought to be hers, but it would turn out that they were not. There were also some reports of seeing a woman walking along the nearby Togwitee Pass Road, but these could not be verified to have been her. The search went on into October until a massive snowstorm hit, and it was called off for good. Rather oddly, shortly after the end of the search, a woman was found in Bridgeport, Nebraska, who allegedly looked so much like Olga that she had to be ruled out. At the time, it was seen as a very odd disappearance for several. The search went on that Olga had been hunting and fishing in that same area since she was a child, and was very familiar with the terrain, meaning that it seems unlikely she could have gotten lost, and even if she had, why hadn't she called out for help or answered calls out to her? Carl had allegedly been gone for only 20 minutes, so wouldn't she be able to hear him? Also, how could she have managed to so completely elude the dogs and trackers? Why would she have wandered off from her spot on that rock in the first place? No one knew, but there were ideas. One idea was that she had gone down to the road and either hitchhiked a ride or been kidnapped, but why would she have gone there? Another was that she had simply gotten lost and met with misfortune, but with her knowledge of the area this seemed unlikely, and again, why would she have gone off into the wilderness to begin with? It could also have been a bear attack, but again, this would have made a commotion, and no body or signs of an animal attack had been found. As more information came in, there was also seen the possibility that she had run away to start a new life. It would turn out that her marriage was not as blissful as had been thought, when Olga's sister claimed that the couple had been on the rocks, arguing frequently, and that Olga had been unhappy with the marriage, and had regretted having the wedding so soon. In this scenario, Olga had used the elk hunting trip as a ruse for her escape, knowing that with her outdoor survival skills, no one would be able to follow her. After this, all she had to do was go to the nearby road and hitch a ride to a new life. This might help explain how she was able to evade the search party, and it would also explain the oddity of her wanting her husband to continue on while she took a rest. If she had run away, then it was actually a pretty good plan. Another, more ominous possibility was that it had been foul play. It would be found that Carl had been dating a woman by the name of Ella Chak for 5 or 6 years when he had met Olga at a dance. It had apparently been serious enough that they had been considering marriage, and Ella was reported as having been very upset about Carl running off with Olga, to the point that it was claimed she had threatened to commit suicide. Yet another witness close to her claimed that Ella and Carl had continued seeing each other after Carl's marriage to Olga, something that Carl vehemently denied. The idea here is that Carl had perhaps murdered Olga to get out of his marriage and get back with Ella, and there were some sinister clues that supported this. One was that he would later contradict his statement that he had been gone 20 minutes, giving a different figure. Even more damning is that the native guides made the observation that Carl Mauger's path away from his wife to the spot he claimed to have gone would have kept him in full view of her sitting place from the moment he left her to the moment he claimed he had returned. An excerpt from the Casper Star Tribune says of this: they also pointed out that, although the country is rugged, it is open, and that Mauger was in full view of the place where he claimed he left his wife until he reached a small path where he said he turned around and retraced his steps. If this is true, then she would have never been out of his line of sight at all. It seems pretty ominous, but without any real evidence of wrongdoing there was nothing to go on, and Carl Mauger was never pursued as a suspect. In a curious aside, he would be arrested not long after and put in jail after being mistaken for a wanted criminal who just happened to be his doppelganger and had the name Carl Mauger. Weird, also rather odd, or to be expected, depending on your stance. Carl would later remarry, this time with Ella, the one he had been dating when he married Olga. Coincidence or not? We are left to ask ourselves what happened to Olga? Was this a tragic accident or foul play? Where did she go that day and what became of her? Considering it is one of Wisconsin's oldest cold cases and there have been no new clues in decades, we will probably never know for sure.
Number 2.
Christmas Day 1971 in Anchorage, Alaska broke at a balmy 40 degrees above zero, a welcome relief from the Arctic cold front that gripped the city only days before. At the height of the storm, gale force winds snapped power lines and lifted a 20 by 20 foot cornice off the side of a mountain, depositing it in the middle of Seward Highway. But now, with the promise of blue skies, folks in Anchorage were propelled out of their houses and into the light. Among those driven into the sun were Gary Lawler and his brother Dennis. They traveled south on the Seward Highway, along a strip of water called Turnagain Arm, to take photos of the wilderness that lay at their feet. Armed with Dennis's ancient camera, they decided to stop at Bird Point, one of their favorite spots, and then work their way north again, taking photos along the way. Almost by chance, they stopped at McHugh Creek State Park, 12 miles north of Bird Point. Built between two intersecting ridges on either side of its namesake creek, there was a waterfall that Dennis wanted to capture. On a small ledge about 20 feet below a picnic area, he found the perfect spot. A steep overlook that cast the Gnarl Creek bank in a perfect cone of sunlight. Dennis struggled to focus the camera from this awkward perch, pushing it deep into his ribsage to maintain his balance. Then, behind a bush no more than 10 feet in front of him, he spied what looked like a mannequin, dropped at an odd angle, and partially covered with snow. He craned his neck forward to get a better look. It was a body. A young woman, nude from the waist down, a soft cover of downy snowflakes across her exposed thighs. Back in the parking lot, Dennis told his brother about his gruesome find. "Are you sure?" his brother asked. "Because if it's a body, we'll have to report it to somebody." In 1971, boomers were taking over the streets of downtown Anchorage, lured by the promise of the get-rich oil discovered on the North Slope. Along 4th Avenue, which comedian Bob Hope once called the longest bar in the world, they packed the bars and saloons, looking for drugs and drinks in places with names like the Silver Dollar and the Nevada Club. But that's not all they were looking for. There were nights nights when the Cadillacs were parked 3 deep, so the prostitutes could ply their holiday trade. 3 miles south, in Spenard, massage parlors were springing up like mushrooms. The parlors were barely disguised fronts for prostitution, run by men who kept a pistol close at hand. No place seemed safe, no one seemed safe. Already that year, an 18-year-old real estate secretary had been confronted at her apartment by a man who wanted to force her into sex at gunpoint. She screamed, the assailant ran, and her roommates called the police. Anchorage was turning into a cop's nightmare. For Sergeant Walter Gilmore of the Alaska State Troopers, that Christmas Day would be the worst. He didn't realize it yet, but he was about to experience his first brush with future serial killer Robert Hansen. The sergeant was just finishing the last knot in his tie when the phone rang. He was fresh from the shower after a day of cross-country skiing with his family, and on his way to his in-laws' house for Christmas dinner. Sergeant Gilmore, this is dispatch, the female voice said, detached and professional. We have been advised that a woman has been found dead in McHugh Creek Campground. Patrol is on the way, sir, but we wanted to alert you. Christmas dinner would have to wait. Troopers soon learned that a woman named Celia Beth van Zanten had gone missing on December 23rd. Just 18 years old, she was on her way to a local convenience store when she disappeared. At the crime scene, they found a woman who seemed to match the description. Young, fair complexion, long blonde hair. Her wrists were tied behind her back with speaker wire. She had been sexually assaulted and her chest slashed with a knife. Somehow before her death, she had managed to escape her assailant. She literally ran for her life. Her first fall was 50 feet from the presumed location of the murderer's car. With her hands bound behind her, and in snow 3 feet deep on a dizzying slope, it would have taken a superhuman effort to regain her feet and continue the descent into what must have seemed a black hole. She got within 10 to 15 feet of the waterfall, but somehow turned away at the last minute. In the days since she'd gone missing, temperatures ranged from a low of -5 to a high of 22. She had frozen to death. In the parking lot, investigators found a collage of tire prints spinning in lazy, concentric circles, indicating that the woman's abductor had been looking for her. With the rain starting to drizzle, Gilmore watched dismally as the evidence melted before his eyes. The police ended up taking photographs instead. Their scene search of the surrounding area, meanwhile, turned up a silver belt buckle and, later, a black leather belt. In the snow near the body, investigators also found tufts of yellow tissue paper. That was all they ever found. Their next move was to canvass Beth's neighborhood and interview family members. Everyone they spoke to offered statements that were soon contradicted. Her brothers seemed to be stoners who barely noticed Beth's comings and goings. Gilmore's best suspect was Greg, her Alaska native foster cousin, who lived with the family and was said to have a fractious relationship with the victim. Out clubbing and drinking the night Beth disappeared, Greg had allegedly arranged for her to babysit for one of his friends. His accounts of his whereabouts the night of December 23 ranged from vague to imprecise, though he was rarely alone during a long night of carousing. Worse yet, although Greg claimed to have talked to Beth at the house on the night of her disappearance to ask about babysitting, her brothers said they never saw him. The most anyone could say with certainty about Beth's foster cousin was that he was drunk that night. So drunk that Anchorage police eventually stopped him and his friends and made them take a cab home. Neighborhood witnesses, meanwhile, reported seeing Beth as late as 11 o'clock the night she disappeared. She was hitchhiking. Some of Gilmore's investigators thought that's precisely what this was. A hitchhike-type case, where a stranger picks up a woman and brutalizes her, confident his identity will never be learned. Sergeant Gilmore worked the case for 24 hours straight before he got his first break. He was at his makeshift office in a trailer, the schoolroom clock nearing 2100 hours. The place was silent, nearly empty. Suddenly, the intercom came on. Sergeant Gilmore. Line 2. On the other end of the line was a senior officer in the troopers. JP was one of the first Alaska natives to join the troopers, a man whose exploits in rural Alaska were legendary. When he called, you listened. Hey, look, he said. I've been hearing about that dead girl down to McHugh Creek. I think I got an informant that may be able to help you. JP told Gilmore that the informant might have been working the street. Gilmore said he talked to anyone, only later did he learn that the informant was JP's daughter. Sandra Patterson was 18 and working the streets to pay for her heroin habit. She told Sergeant Gilmore that on the night of December 19th, she was in the parking lot of the Nevada Club when she was kidnapped at gunpoint by a man who said he'd kill her if she didn't do what he wanted. She described him in detail. Between 23 and 28 years old, probably 5'8" or 5'9", slender, wearing horn-rimmed glasses. After binding her hands with leather shoelaces, he drove her south on the Seward Highway. Along the way, he kept pulling off the road, telling her he wanted to make love to her. He tried to kiss her, made her strip down so she couldn't escape, said he wanted to slash her bra with his knife. She kept telling him, "No, I don't want to do it in the car." He finally got a motel deep into the Kenai Peninsula at Cooper Landing, 98 miles south of Anchorage. They tried to have sex, but he failed to orgasm. Sandra didn't want him to snap again. He'd already slapped her hard across the face, and her passivity seemed to thwart his pleasure. He expected her to fight, just like other girls he'd had. From the way he acted, she was sure he had killed them. On the way back to Anchorage, he threatened to kill her if she ratted him out. Once, he drove her deep into the wilderness, and she had to talk him back. In those days before computers, cops had what they called the asshole book with photos of every pervert and predator they'd come across. Sandra scanned it page by page and column by column. "That's it," she finally said. "That's him." Him was Robert C. Hansen, later known as the Butcher Baker. Gilmore learned that he'd been arrested barely a month before on the assault with a deadly weapon charge involving the real estate secretary. When he kidnapped Sandra, he was out on his own recognizance, awaiting trial for the November incident. This man had no shame. Sandra, meanwhile, was ready to speak her piece. "You know," she said, "I may be doing something that some people don't think is totally acceptable, and it may not be. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because that Robert Hansen guy is probably a premeditated, cold-blooded killer who has killed before." Sandra stubbed out her cigarette with force before continuing. "He said he killed before, and everything he said was absolutely true. Everything he said he would do to me came true. Everything he said he would do, he did. Every threat he made, I believed. And if he says he's killed people, I believe he's killed people. And if you've got a young girl who's been killed around the same time, and in the same area, then I believe it was Hansen who killed her. I believe he'll kill me too." When the Anchorage police interviewed Robert Hansen on December 29, 1971, he claimed to have only vague memories of the Patterson incident, at one point claiming, "I can't remember going down there to the Nevada Club, just doesn't seem like I would just before Christmas." Then he abruptly called off the interview, saying he wanted to talk to his attorney and his doctor. He was already moving toward a psychiatric defense in the case involving the real estate secretary. He would use the same explanation for the rape and kidnapping of Sandra Patterson. By the time of his sentencing in March of 1972, Hansen had convinced the judge that he wasn't so dangerous after all. He was married and had a child. His church friends testified to their high regard for him. His employer told the court he was a capable and willing worker. His psychiatrist persuaded the court that these offenses were related to Hansen's manic depression. As the judge put it at Hansen's sentencing, "I believe that this offense was committed, as the doctor tells us, during a period of disassociation, which he states is a condition which arises from your mental condition." Robert Hansen would perfect the upstanding citizen defense, drawing upon it each time he had a suspicious run-in with the women of Anchorage. It worked. The Patterson case was dismissed in exchange for a no-contest plea in the assault of the real estate secretary. Robert Hansen was convicted and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment on the condition that he continued to receive psychotherapy because, the judge noted, your condition is one that may be treatable. He was paroled on November 1, 1973, less than 2 years later. Robert Hansen steadfastly denied his involvement in the death of Celia Beth Van Zanten. During his 1984 confession, he was asked about taking a girl to McHugh Creek in 1971. Hansen blurted out Van Zanten case, then said, "No, I didn't have nothing to do with that. They asked me about the Van Zanten case when I was in trouble with the Patterson girl back in 1971. But no, I didn't have nothing to do with that. The murder of Beth van Zanten has never been solved, but the similarities between her abduction and Sandra's are worth noting. They were taken to the same area, their hands bound, they were stripped to prevent escape, their bras slashed, or threatened to be, they were sexually assaulted. It should also be said that Beth van Zanten's house was within a mile of the real estate secretary's apartment. Hansen had cruised that area before. Indeed, Hansen admitted to stalking women throughout his criminal career, starting with the real estate secretary, whom he spotted in downtown Anchorage, and then followed home, and continuing through Sandra Patterson and many others. Sandra Patterson's words were prophetic. 12 years later, Robert Hansen admitted to murdering 17 women, though police believe he killed many more. The tragedy was that, for a brief moment in 1971, there had been the opportunity to stop him. Instead, he became the worst serial killer in Alaska history.
Number 3.
On May 30, 1974, Annita Price of Moundsville disappeared on her way to work. She was never found, and for 42 years, she has been listed as a missing person. All these years later, her children are still trying to figure out what happened to their mom. With the help of the West Virginia State Police, they may soon have some answers in the cold case. Madonna Lane was just 5 years old when her mother, Annita Price, was reported missing after she left for work, but never made it there. A tip had come in 2004 to the West Virginia State Police that led the family to believe that foul play could have been involved. 42 years later, the family is back in Marshall County conducting a search where they believe Anita's body may be buried, near the gypsum plant. We've had dogs in the area, human remained dogs, run several times, Lane said. Yesterday would have been, I think, the third or fourth time that we've had dogs run. Dogs keep alerting to something in this one particular area in front of the plant that we were looking at. We really feel like it's necessary to dig. Something is there. In 1974, when Anita went missing, the gypsum plant didn't exist. The area where several human remain dogs have responded to is not covered by a road or building, so it is possible to excavate. The family and team of experts ran into some problems digging on Saturday, and they have to reroute a water source before the dig can continue. Lane and her brother said they are cautiously optimistic that the search will give them some of the answers they need. Several groups of experts and workers are in town for the dig, but it is hard to tell when work will resume due to the water source relocation. We just want to find our mom. It's been 42 years, and we want to be able to put her to rest properly, and we just want answers, Lane said. She said if the dig does not result in the discovery of her mother's remains, investigators will at least know they can turn their attention elsewhere and help the family find some closure 4 decades past due.
Number 4.
On Halloween, excited children tell stories of the killer with the hook on his hand, and of the phone call that comes from inside the house. At heart, they know that these are nothing more than fanciful tales. But as recently as 20 years ago, Olga Madison was in the grip of a scary story that was unfortunately all too real. From 1968 to 82, 7 young women were mysteriously killed in the Madison area in a string of murders dubbed the Mad City Murders or Capital City Killings. Most of the women had long hair parted in the middle and some connection to the university. 2 of the victims were actually murdered on university grounds. None of the murders have ever been solved, and speculation remains that Madison was in the grip of a serial killer. The series of unsolved killings began in May 1968 when a student peeking in the windows of Sterling Hall found the body of Madison freshman Christine Rothschild in the bushes near the stairs. She had been stabbed and strangled. Police pursued several possible suspects but were not able to bring anyone to trial. Marv Belausek, a reporter for the Wisconsin State Journal who covered the story in his book 50 Wisconsin Crimes of the Century, said the Rothschild murder shocked many people on the quiet Madison campus. I do know that the Christine Rothschild case, the first one, really kind of jolted people because the campus seemed really serene at that point, he said. There was a real examination of whether the university police should be abolished. Some people felt that they weren't protecting campus. Rothschild's death was forgotten amid the campus turmoil of the Vietnam War era. But in the late 70s, women began disappearing in rapid succession. The burned body of Deborah Bennett, 20, was found in a ditch west of Cross Plains in July 1976. Next to be killed was Julie Ann Hall, 18, a library assistant at the Wisconsin Historical Society, whose body was found in a shallow grave outside of Waunakee in the summer of 1978. Julie Spearschneider, 20, disappeared in March 1979 after leaving a University Avenue bar and was found in the Yahara River 2 years later. A blow to the head killed Hall, while Bennett and Spearschneider were too decomposed to determine their causes of death. Police began looking for connections and noticed all the victims were attractive, had long hair and lived in Madison. The murders continued as the city grew more frightened. Susan LeMahieu, 24, a cognitively disabled graduate of Madison East High School, disappeared in December 1979. Her body was found that spring in the Madison Arboretum. She had been stabbed to death. Shirley Stewart, 17, disappeared in January 1980 after leaving the Dean Clinic and was found in July 1981 in a forest north of Madison. Detectives suspected that the same predator killed the 5 women. On July 2, 1982, the most audacious of the murders occurred when Donna Mraz, 19, was stabbed to death in front of Camp Randall Stadium. People who heard her screams ran to her just in time to see her assailant run off. According to Belausek, like the Rothschild killing 14 years earlier, the Mraz murder left many students concerned about their safety. What was most unusual about it is that it happened in an area where there were people around, he said. Although the strangling death of Janet Roche, 20, in Portage County, bore striking similarity to the Dane County cases, Mraz's death was the end of the series of murders in the Madison area. As the years went by, police began to see the first and the last homicides, those of Rothschild and Mraz on university grounds, as separate cases with different perpetrators than the 5 middle deaths. Belausek said the Rothschild and Mraz cases were different from the others, partly because the police had more suspects in them. The Christine Rothschild one, I do believe that they had a suspect in that, and they followed him to New York, Belausek said. I think they identified somebody, but they never could pin it on him. Also, the Donna Mraz case, they did have a suspect in that who was in prison and they tested him. University of Wisconsin Police Department Detective Doug Scheller, the officer assigned to the Mraz case, said he also believes the Mraz killing was unrelated to the others. We've never developed any connection between them, and from what happened, and how it happened and so on, we don't honestly think there's a connection, he said. However, many people still believe the murders of Bennett, Hall, Spearschneider, LeMahieu, and Stewart were committed by the same perpetrator. In 1984, serial killer Henry Lee Lucas told investigators that he and his partner, Otis Toole, had passed through Madison many times on their way to Minnesota, and he confessed to several of the Madison murders. But his reputation for false confessions and the fact that he was in prison during some of the murders cast doubt on his credibility, and he later withdrew his admittances. According to Belausek, detectives were certain Lucas had killed at least Hall and Spearschneider. I think he probably was involved in a couple of them, he said. I was convinced at the time there were some really skilled and veteran detectives from both the Dane County Sheriff's Department and the Madison Police Department that questioned him, and they felt that he really knew some details about where the bodies were. The case files for these 7 murders have long gone cold, but for the detectives involved and the families of the victims, these stories will never reach their conclusion. While children hear about imaginary murders and students dress up as killers this Halloween, Madison's real serial killer will remain unknown.
Number 5.
On June 1, 1948, Mary Virginia Carpenter set out to the campus of her new college, Texas State College for Women, known now as Texas Women's University, in Denton. After taking the train, she took a taxi the rest of the way, of which the driver, Edgar Ray Jack Zachary, dropped her off at Brackenridge Hall at 9 p.m. According to Zachary, he saw her get out of his cab, then walk over to a light-colored convertible. The vehicle was parked just outside the dorm, and Carpenter proceeded to speak with its 2 male occupants, as if she knew them. Unfortunately, neither of these 2 men have ever been identified, and Carpenter would never be seen or heard from again. On June 4th, Carpenter's boyfriend, Kenny Branham, called Carpenter's mother out of worry, having been unable to get a hold of her since 3 days prior. With her mother now also worried, the police were called, and Mary reported as missing. At the beginning of the investigation, Zachary was looked at as the prime suspect. Reportedly the last person to see Carpenter, his wife told the police that he had been home at 10 p.m. that night. Shortly afterward, Zachary took a polygraph of which he passed. On June 9, 1955, under Texas civil law, Carpenter was declared legally deceased. In 1959, in Jefferson, Texas, a box of human remains were recovered about 200 miles from Denton, which contained bones and the skull of an unidentified woman. The unknown woman was estimated to have been the same height as Carpenter, and oddly enough, also found to have had one leg shorter than the other, just like Carpenter. In spite of this promising lead, however, subsequent dental records from the skull confirmed the remains as not belonging to the missing woman. Years later, Zachary's wife admitted to lying about her husband's whereabouts the evening Carpenter vanished. She added by saying that he did not come home until around 2 or 3 the following morning. In 1957, Zachary was charged with an unrelated sexual assault. Despite never being connected to Carpenter's disappearance, Zachary later took another polygraph test and passed it. He eventually passed away in 1984. In May of 1998, a man in his 70s came forward with claims of knowing who killed Carpenter and where her body was buried. He claimed her body was buried on the grounds of the very college she planned on attending. After excavating the area, nothing was found to corroborate this claim, and the 2 individuals named as her killers were also discovered to have been long deceased. Many of those familiar with Carpenter's case speculate that she could have fallen victim to an unidentified serial killer. Known as the Phantom Killer of Texarkana, the serial killer attacked 8 people, 5 of whom were killed, in the Texarkana area in the span of several months in 1946. Interestingly enough, Carpenter did know 3 of the victims of this serial killer. To date, the Phantom Killer has never been caught or named.